Welcome back to the second day of NHS Providers Governance Conference. I'm Miriam Deakin, Director of Policy at NHS Providers. I'm delighted to lead us into our first panel session on what makes a good partnership, and delighted to welcome our first panel for the day, who bring real depth and breadth of experience across a range of sector types and different local contexts. So hugely warm welcome to Fiona Noden, Chief Exec at Bolton NHS FT, who's going to talk to us a little bit about working in a large system and also maintaining local identity when you've got the pull of a big city like Manchester. Warm welcome to Helen Ray, Chief Exec at North East Ambulance Service FT. Helen can obviously speak to working across a really considerable geography and within some ICSs which are in themselves quite large. And warm welcome to Ify Okocha, Chief Exec at Oxleas NHS FT, who's been leading a number of quite deep partnerships for the last few years, and is in the interesting position, I think, of the recent Act and recent focus on provider collabs actually catching up with some of the work that he and colleagues have been leading in mental health services. So a great panel. In terms of the format, we're going to hear from each of our speakers in turn, but as I mentioned earlier, you can post chats in the Q&A app. You can post your questions in the Q&A app at any time, and I'll pick those up for you when we get to questions and answers after we've heard from our panel. So without further ado, I'm going to turn first to Fiona, please, to give us your perspective.
Good morning, Miriam. Good morning, everybody. So I think there'll be some themes that will come out of the three speakers this morning, and we should coalesce around the fact that it's all about relationships. So I'm going to talk about three things today. One is around our Provider Federation Board across Greater Manchester. The second one is around what's happening in place. And then the third one is around what's happening in our localities. So the first one around PFB, Provider Federation Board. Around Provider Federation Board. This is a collaborative of acute providers, including mental health providers, acute providers, and community providers, who have been working together for a long time since prior to the Greater Manchester devolution. Things have changed quite considerably in the last 2 years, mainly due to the fact we have a common cause regarding COVID and how we work collaboratively together for the sake of our patients. So Greater Manchester serves a population of almost 3.2 million. We have 10 localities in Greater Manchester, and we have a number of providers that provide services across and individually across those localities. So through Provider Federation Board, we established what we call GM Gold. Sounds very grand, but it was all the providers coming together to ensure that we kept our patients safe and made sure that we could make sure our staff were looked after throughout the pandemic. It also supported around mutual aid. So Greater Manchester has been and continues to be really hit hard through the ongoing workings of the pandemic. So we had created the mutual aid through GM Gold to make sure that we could transfer patients to places in critical care that could look after them when our critical care units were becoming extremely busy. So it was about relationships, it was about the common cause, and it was about engaging with our providers to make sure that our patients were looked after. I can't say it was easy, and it continues to be an ongoing piece of work that we're managing, which leads me on to the second part of PFB around our elective recovery programme. So elective recovery, again, we've got 470,000 people on the waiting list in Greater Manchester. We all know that each organisation has been working through the pandemic, and we cannot continue to just do the patients in our locality. So again, it's that mutual aid, the common purpose around making sure that we can look after our patients in the right place by the right people, with some of our staff moving into different organisations to look after those people. The governance around it is quite loose, but it's about the relationships. The governance is supported through GM Gold. So moving on to place and the locality in Bolton. So Bolton is, we have 300,000 people in Bolton that contribute part of Greater Manchester. We are very much part of Greater Manchester, but we have our distinct identity. Bolton is a coterminous local authority, so we're one CCG, one FT, and one local authority that work collectively together. We have a common purpose again, and that's about supporting our local population to be as healthy and positive as possible. So how do we do that? We do that through our integrated care partnership, which is hosted by the Foundation Trust. So our integrated care partnership is, we established that over 4 years ago. So it's been a number of years in the making. We're 2 years into fully establishing it. So the integrated care partnership, the managing director is the Director of Social Services. So obviously her contract is held by the council, but we host her contract 2 days a week. So she reports directly into the Foundation Trust. Our community services division is managed through the integrated care partnership. So much as the relationship is one thing, actually there's a power dynamic too. So we have given the power to manage our community services to the local authority through the auspices of the Director of Social Services. So governance is often seen as relationships, absolutely, but the power dynamics behind it is also what makes things work too. And I think my advice is don't be precious about power. The most powerful thing we can do is gift that power to somebody else. And that's what we've done with our community services. So I'm going to stop there and hand back over to Miriam. And hopefully there'll be a number of questions following that. Thank you very much.
Fantastic, Fiona, thank you. That's given us a lot of food for thought, hasn't it, that we can come back to in the discussion. So I'm going to invite Helen to give her perspective next, and then Ify, and we'll come back to questions. So over to you, Helen. Thank you.
Thanks, Miriam, and morning, everybody. North East Ambulance Services is quite an interesting dynamic within the ICS because, of course, like all ambulance services, we touch every single corner of our integrated care system. In the North East, that is 3,500 square miles. It is multiple sites, multiple organisations, and a real spread across coastal, rural and urban environments. And all of you will know that each of those bring their own challenges. As an ambulance service, we're dealing with all of those in the same context all of the time. When I was thinking about today and what partnership meant, I do tend to think in pictures. So I kept coming back to a little bit of a jigsaw in terms of what does partnership mean for all of us collectively. And when I started thinking about the jigsaw pieces, I know when I was small and used to do probably more jigsaws than I have time for now, the edge pieces were always the things that we looked for first. And if you could find the four corners, that was the best way to start. And when I was thinking about this and partnership, I started to think about the four corners as being where we build trust. So without trust in partnership, there will be no success. And then if you build your edge pieces, for me, that was the good governance part. So you need a really strong framework, and the work that has been going on across the North East and North Cumbria has been really to build that framework ready to make sure that the delivery, the centrepiece, the vision that we have when all of our pieces come together has a really strong building around it to make sure that we all hold safe together. And the middle of the jigsaw really has to be the picture that we all want to build. And our chair, Sir Liam Donaldson, has been really clear about that during the time that he has been with us, and has built really strongly, collectively, with all of the jigsaw piece holders, a vision for the future that helps us to deliver something that will be a legacy, I think, that will last differently to the task to finish pieces that we normally bring together. The picture in the centre of the jigsaw is the thing that we all want to build. It has to have a central vision. It has to have a common purpose. And I think, as Fiona already alluded to, it has to be built around the people that matter. And they are the citizens that we serve as provider organisations. And it's not a 250 piece jigsaw, is it? It's the most complex 10,000 piece jigsaw that we've ever seen. And it's, you know, it's shades of grey all the way through. And if you try to build a jigsaw that is just all shades of grey, that's a tough ask. But that's beholden on us. And all of those pieces aren't sitting in a box. They're all sitting on different people's tables. So how you bring them together to be able to build that final piece is really important. For me, partnership is about how we recognise the importance of every single piece, and that we let go a bit of our traditional boundaries and ways of working. And dare I say, sometimes our arrogance as we sit in a room with our own needs and wants at the forefront of our mind. Partnership is about putting those to one side, and we've got to support each other in that compliance. Because we have such big geographical spread and such a balance of wealth and deprivation, we cannot necessarily do that all in equal measure. There is prioritisation to be done in partnership. The work to get us ready in the North East and North Cumbria has been positive, but it hasn't all been plain sailing, and it won't be as we move forward. It's important, isn't it, that we recognise that collective development with wider partners, recognising every part of our system, you know, in our volunteers, in our adult social care frame, in our educational frame, and our universities, and multiple other partners has been really important. But the proof will be in the consistency of making sure that we can hold those jigsaw pieces together. And lastly for me, but really I think most importantly, it's coming back to that piece about trust. It's really easy to Google, isn't it, what makes good partnership? Some of us will have had a little look at that as we prepared. And the consistent message, no matter what you are looking at, whether it's the Harvard reviews, whether it is the local integrated care systems and the websites that are being set up, the plain truth behind all of it is we can't all be first, we can't all be dominant, and we can't all be the alphas in the room. Partnership is about walking over that threshold and letting go of that, and putting something else as your priority in the front of our mind. So as we think about the integrated care systems, the provider collaboratives that will support the integrated care partnerships, and we're all going to call things something slightly different, just to add to the complexity, because aren't we all very good at that? So without any consistency of message for how you do this, everyone will do things slightly differently. But the core of the message is how we hold together with trust, how we fit those edge pieces together for our governance and build the very best picture that we possibly can for the people who we are beholden to serve. Thank you, Miriam.
Thank you, Helen. It's really inspirational analogy there with the jigsaw. I love that. Thank you. Really thought-provoking. Ify, it'd be great to turn to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Morning. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, perfect, Ify.
Good morning, everyone. And it's really nice to be here. Always good to go last, which means that I then don't have to repeat or echo what colleagues have already said. So I thought it would help to just start by painting a picture of where we are and then taking you on a journey that we've been on for several years. So I want to talk about one particular partnership, because as I'm sure you've heard, there are several forms of partnerships that have evolved, not least in the last year. So I want to talk about the South London Partnership, which is a collaboration by 3 trusts that are somewhat different. So I'm from Oxleas, who provide mental health, community health services, as well as prison health care. South London and Maudsley provides mental health, as does South West London and St. George's. And we came together in 2017 to create the South London Partnership. ambition really were two main things. The first is, how can we provide care to people closer to their homes, and how can we therefore add value not just to their lives but to the NHS. As you see, the population is on your screen, the number of boroughs, and with the creation of the ICSs, we now the partnership spans 2 ICSs, and we'll come back later to talk a little bit about that. And we've got about 10,000 staff, and the demand is really high. Next slide, please. So as I said, formed in 2017, not a legal entity or an organization, but just a collaboration. Although it took us about 3 years before we formally took over commission responsibilities at all, those 3 years were really quite instrumental, particularly when you reflect on some of the points that Fiona and Helen have made in terms of when you come together, how do you then agree how you're going to work? So it wouldn't surprise you to know that the first thing we had to overcome was reassuring our staff that this is not a merger. We have no intentions of dissolving any trust and creating a South London trust or whatever. This was just about finding synergies and trying to work together to improve care. And also, in the course of those 3 years, we began to do a number of other things that I'll talk about in my next slide. So in 2020, we took over specialist commissioning for secure care, CAMS Tier 4 adult eating disorders. And because there are 3 trusts, we each decided to take responsibility as portfolio leads for each of those. So Oxleas took responsibility for secure care, CAMS became the responsibility of the South London and Maudsley, adult eating disorders became the responsibility of South West London and Georges. And then later we took on the complex care, which we now share jointly. Next slide, please. So, of course, we've since revisited our vision and our goals, and I don't think anyone will look at this slide and think, oh, that's not right. You know, the main thing was about how do we bring people closer home, closer to their families, and how do we work effectively across South London. And the goals I've already touched on, they outlined on the slide there. Next slide. So some of the key achievements, so we've managed to reduce admission to hospital for young people by 32%. And this has largely been through targeted investment, where we've had to create crisis services across all of South London to be more responsive and to be out of hours. We still have some way to go in making those crisis teams 24/7. Because we think that that's going to be the real thing that makes a difference. So we can support young people and their families at home. We've brought back lots of patients who were in forensic beds all over the country. And we've also, by so doing, reduced readmissions. We've created step-down facilities for many of those, which has meant that they've been able to go from medium through low secure where that's necessary to appropriate accommodation in the community. Lots and lots of complex cases have been reviewed, and I'm pleased to say that we continue to step those down. But I need to emphasize that these are just CCG-funded complex cases. And this is one of those issues to do with partnership, that one of the criticisms we've had from our social care colleagues has been that we've gone off and done this on our own because, of course, we started with specialists. And so when we got to the table to discuss complex care, both local authority funded and CCG funded, they weren't really interested. So we went ahead with the CCG funded cases. And again, I will talk a little bit more as we now go into mental health provider collaboratives and local care partnerships, how that's playing into some of our discussions. And as I've said, we've reinvested quite a bit of the money into new care models. And in those intervening 3 years, some of the things we got up to were included creating unique employee passports. So staff could move from one organization to the other without having to do the checks, etc. Shared career development pathways as well, and great work by my nursing colleagues who have not just created Band 4 nursing associates, advanced clinical practitioners, but have also been able to create other leadership career development arrangements that our nurses have really, really valued. Next slide. So in terms of how we've managed to do this and how we've strengthened our culture and the governance, I think one of the real strengths of the partnership is that we have firstly put patients and their support networks at the heart of everything we do. And we've also done everything through clinicians. So we have very strong clinical leadership, strong clinical involvement, and they've really been empowered, if you like, to drive the improvements that we've realized over the years. With respect to governance, we've tried to be very flexible and nimble on our feet, either creation of a program board led by a CEO, and then a portfolio board that looks at everything, and then committees in common to which we've invited our non-executive directors, and we have all of our chairs in the same virtual room at the same time, discussing and agreeing issues. And of course, at every program and at every opportunity, we have services, also their representatives, who are part of those discussions. And as we develop new services, so for example, we're thinking about developing perinatal and women's psychiatric intensive care units because we don't have enough. We have services also involved in some of those discussions. Next slide. So we've come to the point now where we have our integrated care boards being set up. As I said before, we span two ICSs, the Southeast London and the Southwest London. And there has been a discussion as to whether the pan-South London provider collaborative that we have, the SLP, whether that should serve both the Southeast and the Southwest, or whether we need to create separate ones. And we'll come to a decision that we may have to create separate ones. Next slide. So in deciding to create separate ones, we've agreed, however, that there are certain things that we must continue to do together. And we've just recently, in the last month, completed 2 events face-to-face, invited senior clinicians from across the 3 organizations to think about what those things could be. Things like psychosis, can we be absolutely clear about how we support and manage people with psychosis? Can we begin to think more realistically about how we address the mind-body dichotomy that has existed for many years in our National Health Service? Can we begin to think about trauma and how we make sure that we provide the appropriate care for people with trauma, histories of trauma and personality disorder, etc. But also, next slide, please. There are those questions about place. How do we then invite place, particularly local authority colleagues, as well as the voluntary and care sector to the table, especially in the context of the comments I made earlier about how they have felt that in developing our specialist services and also working more closely with CCGs as they were previously, we've kind of left them on the side. And one of the options that we're exploring is the use of a transformation board across Southeast and Southwest to bring all partners together, including those leaders from place. Next slide. So there are a number of next steps there in terms of, I think we've completed the first 2. I think due diligence is a thing that we now need to concentrate our energies on and also refine some more this notion of bringing all the key players together, because that's the next challenging bit. So even though as 3 organizations we've done really well over the last 5 years, we're almost coming into a new phase of how we broaden that partnership and if you like, go over what we've done previously. Thank you.
Thank you, Ify, and to all three of you, really inspirational contributions to kick us off. So colleagues, do think about what questions you want to ask our panel here and post them in the Q&A app. I can see a few coming through now, but I'm going to just kick us off with a couple, starting with this idea of sort of giving up power. So perhaps if I come to Fiona first, because you talked about the responsibility to cede power. I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about that and how you built the case to do that, whether there were any barriers that you had to overcome with colleagues, because I imagine it can't have necessarily been a smooth ride. And then I'll come to Ify and Helen as well.
Thanks very much, Miriam. I think power can be seen for good as well as evil. And I think if we are confident in our abilities and understand what our values are and understand exactly why we're doing it, power is easy to share. So it's that version, the version of distributed leadership. Actually, we've all got skin in the game here. So how do we always make sure that the centre of what we want to do is clear for everybody? So the clear communications around why we would want to do something, because it's all about patient care, isn't it? It's all about making sure that we're doing things for our service users and improving the offering that we've got to keep them well and healthy. So the power is easy to give if power is not important, but I absolutely understand that power can be so important. So I think it's creating that common purpose. The relationships are really key. So as Helen talked about, trust is absolutely everything here, and you've got to allow trust to grow, and having a OD strategy to support those changes, working with our staff, working from the board all the way down to our staff and vice versa. So our staff absolutely understand why we want to change the positions that we're in, and actually giving power is probably probably more powerful than receiving it. But I think it's being confident in the relationships that you have, that trust is not going to be undermined, and that trust is everything about how do you work together and having those shared values and common purpose. So thanks very much, Miriam.
Thank you. It is quite a cultural shift for us all, isn't it? But a really good journey to be on, I think. Helen, perhaps if I come to you, because you similarly talked about the centre of the jigsaw being a citizen focus. I don't know if you've got any examples of where you managed to work with partners to do something differently that you think served patients better.
Yeah, a great question, Miriam. I think there's a reality around what Fiona said around we're still, as we move into this frame, we're still sovereign organisations with key responsibilities that we are accountable to our boards for, and there is a real kind of grit around that in relation to how do you bring back something within your own frame, my own frame, say in the Ambulance Trust, that would not necessarily traditionally be something that we would want to drive forward because it wouldn't fit with our sovereignty, if that makes some sense. But some good examples of where we have worked collaboratively on that together, and because my frame tends to be urgent and emergency care, has been around really just thinking about where are we best placed to put resource that gets the best outcomes for the patients. So I'll go into that awful territory of handover delays because I think that has been right at the front of everybody's minds, hasn't it? And as an ambulance trust, that has been really difficult for us. But what has been fantastic, and I think not just in the North East North Cumbria, but nationally, has been a recognition from all parties that the harm reduction associated with things like handover delays that come right from somewhere, that where discharges are a problem, and the adult social care system is in a really difficult place, as is primary care, as is community services. The recognition though that actually the person who potentially was coming to most harm was the person who we hadn't seen, the undifferentiated patient waiting in the community. That to me has been nothing short of a revelation within our patch, having everybody from all areas and all organisations having the same conversation about how do you reduce harm, how do we invest in the right structures, how do we invest in the right people to make sure that that is reduced. Now, we haven't got a silver bullet for that, nobody does, but the very fact that the ICS, the provider collaborative that supports it, has been focused and able to have that real honest discussion in a very productive way has for me started to sow the seeds of change and the things that we can do together if we recognise the real crux of an issue and all put every effort into sorting that one out. So that would be one of my really good examples and very fresh, I think, for hopefully those who are listening today.
Thanks, Helen. Pressing, in fact, isn't it? And if I come to you with a version of that question, you did talk about developing relationships, including with the local authority and social care. So I just wonder if you can kind of comment on how you manage those sort of perceptions of power, really, to build that trust.
Yes, I've got to say there are so many dimensions to this, aren't there? One, of course, is the leadership style, the culture that you create, and really whether you're all able to unite around a common goal. So if you think about the journey we've been on, we've had to navigate all of that as healthcare organizations, but having now to consider how we do this with our local authority colleagues, not least the fact that financially they're in a different place compared to us, and there's been a lot of mistrust over the years. And so it's just been about building relationships, communicating, finding common ground, and lots of opportunities to do that. Hasn't been easy over the last 2 years because we've all been on virtual meetings, etc. But now that we've got the opportunity to meet face to face, that's really what we're doing, and we are continuing with that. And I suspect that we're going to continue to do this for quite a few years yet. I think the point that Helen just made about us being sovereign organizations is an interesting one, because we're going into these partnership arrangements, and yet we have to report to our boards, and our boards have to agree to what needs to be done. But I think having created this really, really impressive culture that's driven by practitioners, that's all about users of services and co-producing where possible with them, I think that everyone can unite around those things. And we just need to now bridge that gap when it comes to local authority colleagues. COVID clearly brought us closer. A lot of the work that we've done over the last 2 years, particularly with well-being, etc. For example, I have other roles in the ICS in terms of leading the people board, making sure that we have a well-being hub that addresses the needs of all care and health staff. Those things have really helped in breaking down those boundaries and making people realize that we genuinely are in this together, and we want to move the agenda forward. So there isn't a single formula. I think it's just about players in the system looking for every avenue, every opportunity to strengthen those relationships, keep the communication going, and remain focused on what the common goal is. But I don't want anyone to go away thinking that this is easy. But it's certainly something we've got to do. And I personally believe completely in the whole idea of the ICS, because I think that the last decade of competition and building high walls can only help us so far. If we just look at how we navigated the pandemic, suddenly we had a lot of phrases like mutual benefit, and I think that people, if there's something to have learned from the pandemic, it's the fact that if you collaborate or work together, you're likely to go further.
Thanks, Ify. And Fiona, you wanted to add to that, and then I'll come to some questions from the audience.
Yeah, thanks very much, Miriam. So I would add to the values around some of this is about integrity. So I have been in post just over 2 years, and I've had the pleasure and the honour of just being nominated as our place-based lead in Bolton. And that's not something that I've sought, but actually when I started, obviously the FT's got the biggest expenditure, the biggest budget in our local place, and the GPs, and speaking to our primary care colleagues, they've always assumed that the FT wants to bring the money into the FT, to steal the money away from primary care. Actually, I've spent the last 2 years talking to colleagues in Bolton saying, let's move the money out of the FT. How can we do something far more collaborative that's less about competition and more around making sure that the money is spent in the right place for our communities? So everybody loves a wiring diagram. Everybody wants to know where they fit in the structure. But actually, this is about making sure that people are valued and that the leaders in our system have got the integrity to act. And what we say and what we do are exactly aligned, so that how we behave today is how we behave tomorrow. But so that's the key to some of the governance structures that we put in place. But yeah, we do have wiring diagrams that we bring out, but it is around making sure that the integrity and the people are listened to, and that collaborative working is everything that we do. So thanks, Miriam.
Thanks, Fiona. That's great, isn't it? It's all about the action and the resourcing, isn't it? So I'll turn to our questions in the Q&A app. So it's an interesting one from Damika. Hope I've pronounced your name correctly. What positive and negative impacts have integrated care systems had on forming your partnerships? I think that's interesting, given some partnerships were underway anyway. So I'm going to come to Ify first, I think, and then I'll come to the other members of the panel.
Yeah, so positives. I think that our integrated care systems, given that we've got both the Southeast and the Southwest, recognize that the South London Partnership has been going for a long time, is really quite strong, and has actually achieved some tangible things, and they've seen evidence of how we've reinvested and improved delivery of services for residents. So that's been very positive. They've really been appreciative of this and have often celebrated this. Now, what's the negative? Obviously, we're just at the beginning of it all, but if you recall, I did say that we had quite a time trying to figure out how we can respond to the needs of two different systems, Southeast and Southwest, and the fact that we've gone down this path of separating ourselves. So Oxleas sits entirely in the Southeast London system. Southwest London and St George's sits entirely in the Southwest system, and SLAM straddles the two. And that's been incredibly difficult. So if you were in SLAM, how do you address the needs of Southwest and Southeast? So I think that what the ICS has done, therefore, is to kind of pull us apart. And that's the one thing that we're really struggling with, And so when you look at the pace of change or the pace of formation of the two ICSs, they're very different. Their approaches are different. The delegation and subsidiarity proposals are different. So everything is really different. And so as a partnership, we're responding to both. And because we're very keen to continuously push the frontiers, we're also learning, and sharing. So it's not all been negative, but I think that it's just kind of stressed us a little bit. And we can't wait to get to a point where we feel that we're really on top of this, so that we are not distracted from, again, improving services for our residents. I hope that's been helpful.
Thanks, Ify. And Helen, how does that work out for you? Because your services obviously span ICSs, don't they? So any comment from yourself on sort of the pros and cons of the ICS structure itself?
Yes, I think for us, it has been helpful in drawing together a single focus through the ICS. I'm hopeful that it will help us with, as ambulance sector, with our methodologies for commissioning, for example, because that can be quite disparate, trying to serve several masters within that commissioning framework. Nobody will be quite there yet, but there's a real opportunity, I think, for that. It's drawn together a focus for our people internally, so we can have a richer conversation about where we sit within the framework of the ICS. And I talk to the staff and the teams now about our offer. Where can we make the very best offer for the thematics and the commitments that we're making across the system? It's built a greater platform for trust, I think, for the sector to be able to have a stronger voice within that. Like Fiona, I've only been in this job for 2.5 years, and I wasn't in the ambulance sector prior to that. I was in acute provision. It's very different, this sector. It brings a whole unique set of challenges. I hadn't appreciated, quite honestly, just how unique it is. But I do feel the integrated care system is offering a place for the sector to really embed itself and provide the very best offer it can. But it's been time consuming. I think, as Ify's just said, there's been some distraction, but we have had that common purpose through COVID, real opportunity to build on that. And there has been, and for me, I think still remains, some lack of clarity during this double running phase about the changes from the CCG infrastructure. And obviously the CCGs are much, much bigger than commissioning. That tends to be the frame that we pitch people in our clinical, in our CCG groups, but so much wider, and bringing that forward. And I think still we need some further clarity around how the regulatory framework works and how the integrated care system frame works within that. And that still feels a little bit disjointed, and not necessarily a negative, but just something that needs to have some more focus and work through.
Thanks, Helen. I think that's right. And same question to Fiona. How does it feel from the Manchester region?
Okay, I'll start with the negatives, because I think the positive far outweigh the negatives. But from a negative point of view, we're not doing things quickly enough. We allow bureaucracy to get in the way, and like Helen, there are so many layers that we're still struggling with, and where does place, where's locality, where's the ICS, where's region, where's national. And I think at the moment we've got many masters, and we are allowing some of the bureaucracy to get in the way and allowing governance to be an excuse. So those are the negatives. The positives far outweigh the negatives, and this is about collective responsibility and actually using governance as a framework to move things forward, albeit slightly slowly. But we are much, much, much stronger together with the common purpose. I went to Iftar. I was invited to one of our mosques for Iftar, and they explained prayer to me. So standing together. If you stand alone, one stick is easily broken. 5 sticks standing closer together is much, much harder to break. And that analogy reminds me of how collaborative working in the NHS can function brilliantly well, because when we're all together, standing together, going in the right direction, we will move faster and quicker with the governance around it that supports us. Thanks, Miriam.
Great image. Thank you, Fiona. Just while we're on kind of setting up structures and processes in ICSs, I'm going to ask each of you around NED engagement and what your thoughts and practices are around how you involve NEDs in some of these different partnerships, which are different obviously to a kind of classic sovereign unitary board. So come to that in a second. Meantime, colleagues, if you'd like to keep posting your questions in the Q&A app, that would be fantastic. Where to start? But Ify, perhaps come to you. Do you have NED involvement in any of those partnership structures that you talked about, and what do you think the sort of NED's views are?
Oh, absolutely. We've got NED involvement both internally, because we have a partnership committee led by a NED with 2 more NEDs, and I'm the executive lead who supports that committee, where we think and talk about all our partnerships. Because remember, the SLP is only one. We have partnerships with voluntary sector, partnership with acute trusts that we work with in the same sector, and a number of others. And then I also talked about the committees in common, where we have the 3 chief execs who are present, as well as non-executive directors. So there is NED involvement. We haven't quite got NED involvement in our partnership meetings, perhaps with our place colleagues, because we also have those. So I have 3 local care places around where I work, and we have partnership meetings with each of them, but these are at the chief exec level, and then the non-executive, the chairman and myself will then meet with the chairs and leaders of the councils. So it really is a system where we have lots and lots of opportunities to meet and discuss and partly check that what we're doing makes sense, it's working, think about any issues that we need to iron out, but also be a bit more strategic. So yes, is the answer. I don't think we can do this without NED, particularly when you consider the fact that we are a sovereign organization. And so through NED participation and involvement, there's enrichment of obviously they bring a great deal to those partnership discussions, but they also understand what it is we're doing. And so when we come into the organization to think about how we're doing, there's already quite a body of knowledge in there that people are able to bring different viewpoints. So yes is the answer, and I think it's the ideal way to go because, like I said, we also draw on the value that the NEDs bring to our respective organizations.
Fantastic, thank you. And Fiona, is it the same for you? You talked about the different layers, didn't you? Sort of the provider fed and place and locality. Do you sort of have that challenge function sort of integrated into those levels? We
have certainly got a chairs network. So all the chairs of our provider organisations meet monthly. It's a really good function to make sure that the chairs are all briefed and to understand how we're going to collectively move things forwards. But we've just established a NED meeting along with the chairs for the whole of Greater Manchester. So that will be a really interesting concept to see how they all come together, because we've all, we are, as has been explained, we are still very much sovereign organisations. What I would say though around that place level, it's not just about NEDs, it's about local councillors as well. So the involvement of local councillors. So our locality board in Bolton is chaired by the lead councillor whose health is their portfolio. So we're not just about our NEDs, it's about working with our local authorities. And my final bit is around, actually, we have changed our board of directors so that we're including far more of our community involvement. So we've just appointed a new NED who is who's got the authority around our communities. But we've also added to the board of directors with 3 partners. So our first partner is the Director of Social Services, our second partner is the Director of Public Health, and our third partner is the current chair of the CCG. So we've got a commissioning GP interface as well as part of to change the direction of the board of directors. So it's just, we are moving quite quickly, I think, in our locality to reflect the differences that we need to have as not just the focus around an acute organisation, but very much around what our communities deliver and how we work with social services.
It's really interesting. Thank you. Helen, how's that work for you in terms of the ambulance service?
Yes, so I think we're fairly similar to as Ify and Fiona have described. So the chairs forum is very strong. There is a real commitment in the Integrated Care Board draft constitution to move things forward locally. But I think there is a recognition at this moment in time that both from a non-executive director perspective and also for us in the North East and North Cumbria, we're all FTs. So there is a play in, of course, for governors as well, and making sure that the governors are well cemented as representatives of their local communities. So I think we have a commitment to working that through. We have split our board in a similar way. So because we cover such a big patch, we have, and I don't know if they'll continue to call this, but we've got a single ICS, but 3 ICPs, integrated care partnerships. And we have aligned a responsible director at this moment in time to each of those ICPs. And as the work around how the non-executives fit in, my chair and I will continue a discussion around whether or not we have a responsible non-executive director that feeds in to make that connectivity between ICB and place, because that is a huge challenge for ambulance services given the footprint that we serve. So we have to find a way of having a dispersed leadership model that allows us to adequately engage where we are needed at place-based level. I think the strength of voice at ICS and ICP level is relatively straightforward. It is when you get that dispersal out to place for our sector that is going to be a much greater challenge, given the geography and the fact that our board composition is the same size as everybody else's board composition. So feeding that and having the right representation will continue to be a challenge for us, and I think probably for Ify and mental health trusts as well in a greater or lesser degree.
Yeah. So interesting. That's becoming more complex, isn't it? But they're great answers. Thank you. So I'm going to turn to the chat for a couple of questions. So first, a question for Fiona from Julie Parker. With relationships being so important for partnership working, how do you ensure they're sustained when personnel change?
What a fantastic question, Julie. I think it's the principles and values that we have, and it's not just about the cult of personality, as I think it was explained to me by Matthew Kershaw last week from Croydon, who's doing something quite similar, and which I'm sure if he will know him well. So it's the values that we have and the relationships, because we have to start those relationships with the right intentions, and I think it's making sure that people who are appointed into roles are appointed on a value basis, and not just necessarily on the who looks the most beautiful, but actually who brings the best solutions to the table, as well as able to work in a very collaborative function. I do think the NHS has changed so much in the last few years. Competition was everything to everybody. Actually, competition with a small c is really helpful in how you improve services, but actually it's all about collaboration now. And I think that the leadership programs that the NHS Leadership Academy have been running have been all about doing things slightly differently, all about system working and having the right values and strength-based values to come into roles and leadership. So it's how we portray that through the rest of our organisations as well. So thank you.
That's a great answer. Thank you. And Ify, you wanted to come in there.
Yes, I wanted to come in because I think it's a really interesting question. I was thinking about this as I was speaking earlier, that I'm the third chief executive at Oxleas since we started the South London partnership, and the other two trusts are on their second chief executives, and yet we are as strong as we've ever been. So there's something about how the partnership has been working. It's everything I said earlier: the common goals that we've had, the involvement of clinicians, the involvement of users of services, and the culture that we've therefore created. So the challenge with every change of chief executive, therefore, is about how their leadership style fits in with the culture, rather than them bringing their leadership style and trying to move things away from how it's always been. And I think Fiona is absolutely right. The programs about leadership nowadays emphasize the need to work in partnership, but also I think that most people say now at this level, if you're being considered for a position, it's about the values that you have and whether those values really fit in with those of the organization. But I think that this is something we need to be mindful of going forward as we create a raft of partnerships, local care partnerships, integrated care board, integrated care partnerships, about the individuals and how it's not just going to be about them, but that when they move on, when things change in 3, 4, 5 years, that these systems will continue to work for exactly what they've been set up for, which is to improve delivery to the local people.
Fantastic, thank you. Helen, would you want to add anything?
No, I don't think I've got anything to add to that. I would really support what Fiona and Ify have said, Miriam, so nothing really to add to that one.
Fantastic, thank you. So another good question from the Q&A then, from Adiwale. Has the requirement to maintain organisational sovereignty been a blocker for any of you in making innovative, collaborative decisions? Interesting one. Shall I start with Helen? That's quite a tough question.
I think the honest answer is, of course, it will, and it has, and it will continue to do that, because we have to balance the requirements of our service and the commitment that we make as individuals within our service with that wider collaborative piece. The concern I would have about that is, whilst ever we are focused on the targets, which is what tends to drive us into that direction, we are completely missing the point of the establishment of the integrated care systems, which should and must be about making our focus much more about population health, about employment and well-being, about the green agenda, around the health population, rather than the fixing of issues when actually someone's health has deteriorated, which is what we as providers tend to spend the most time and the most effort and the most money on at this point in time. We have tried lots of times to shift that emphasis, and we haven't succeeded. So whilst the question was, has sovereignty, or has that really impacted, and will it impact in the future? The honest answer has to be yes. But if we go back to what Fiona and Ify have just said about making sure that the leadership of our organisations has a focus on the prize, the discussion that we have should be a different focus of discussion. It should be about what is the balance between A and B and C. What is the right thing to do if we go back to the values that we have signed up to as a collective across our integrated care system footprint? And if those priorities are much more focused on health and well-being, then we've got to find a way of stopping that competitive nature, which, I was brought up in. In reality, most of us who are sitting in chief executive posts were. How do we actually stand to the side of that and visibly show as leaders that we are standing to the side to give our staff who work with us and our partners who work alongside us permission to do something different? So I've actually worked to try and spin that into a positive at the end. So I hope that lands well.
Yeah, which I think you did really well there. Fiona, I'll bring you in because you wanted to contribute.
Thank you. So as the chief executive, I am absolutely understand my rules around being the accountable officer, but actually the job I applied for 2.5 years ago is different to the job that I'm doing now. And that's because there's been a psychological shift in how we want the FT to work. And that is around our board coalescing around what's right for our population. But it is, I think, the sovereign organisation, it's moving and supporting our non-executive directors to see the world slightly differently, because actually we are still very much a sovereign. We have to work as a system. It's the only way we're going to get our hands on the prize of improving health and well-being. But I am reminded about what my director of finance says to me. So she's not just the director of finance of the FT; she's the chief finance officer for Bolton. She's she works across both the FT and the CCG, and she tells me regularly where the money flows is where the power goes. And actually, the finance directors in Greater Manchester have had to work together to balance the books of Greater Manchester and not just our own organisation. So if our DOFs can get it right and support one another to move money around if we need to, then that's how we're going to solve some of the sovereign issues. But we will still be sovereign organisations. We do have a responsibility under the NHS Act. So it's a juggling act, but it's not one that's it's one that's completely and utterly doable.
Great, really positive message. Ify, anything you'd add? And then I'll probably come to my final question for each of you.
Well, I don't think there's much more to add. Will remain sovereign organizations? Definitely, yes. Does it get in the way? Yes. But we find ways to make it happen. So as Fiona and Helen were speaking there, I was thinking, well, can I remember any occasion where my board has said, no, we're not going to do this? In fact, the bulk of the conversation is about, might we be able to address this issue or do this better if we did it together? And the other thing that often comes up is, how are the others doing it? So we're really using the partnership. And in time, I hope we'll use the ICS as a way of fixing problems, including the sort of problems that Helen was commenting on, which are about acute pressures. Often when the ambulance issue was a really critical one over the last month or two, but we didn't address it necessarily as individual organizations. We addressed it as a system. So we all thought about what part we could play to fix the problem. So I think, and I hope that as time goes on, we'll dwell less on the fact that we're sovereign, we're individual organizations, although that's important, that's going to remain, but more about what can we do together to really improve both our immediate delivery, but the health and care of the wider system.
Thank you, Ify. Really inspirational. So just a final question from me. I suppose a chance to kind of sum up all the motivational food for thought that you've given us. I'll start with Ify. If you had one key learning point you'd hope our members in the audience took away from our conversation, what would you have that be?
It's difficult for me to say just one. So I think relationship. And I often think big ears, small mouth. For those who've done QI, you'll understand what that means. You listen, and you speak less until you've understood. But you've got to keep that communication line going.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ify. I'll come backwards up the panel. So come to Helen next.
Don't think I can top that. I would have said communicate. Talk to each other all of the time, even if it feels like a small issue. Those things grow without us giving great focus to them. So talk to each other and walk into the room with trust in your heart and your mind when you are talking to your colleagues.
Thank you, Helen. And Fiona.
So thank you. I can't top it with these 2 ears and one mouth. But what I would say is when it's getting really, so the relationships are great. It's great when the relationships are going well, but when it's going difficult, when it's being more difficult, actually don't walk away from it. Walk towards it because actually something more beautiful will come out of that conflict. And having that trust to have a really straightforward, honest conversation with somebody, it is the way to really move this forwards, because it's all about, it's great when it goes well, but actually it's even better to resolve things when they're tough with the relationships.
Thank you. Well, colleagues, I hope you found this morning's conversation helpful. I certainly feel we've heard from three very inspirational and brave leaders doing things differently in three very different local systems. So my takeaways are certainly that the points that we started with about being citizen-led and Helen's image of the jigsaw in particular, and seeing the patient as being our driver above any concept of organisational sovereignty, and all those points that have been explored and articulated so well just now around values-led leadership. So I hope that that's been helpful. I've certainly found it a really fascinating conversation. So thank you to each of our panel, to Fiona, Helen and to Ify. That does bring us to the close of this session. So I hope you enjoyed it and you have some useful takeaways. The next session will be starting in about 10 minutes, just over, looking at building trust and developing shared cultures in partnership working. So very much a natural development from the conversation that we've just had this morning. Please also do stick around for our member showcase, which will be fantastic. That's at just after 2 o'clock with Merseycare and the South London Partnership, and they'll be sharing with you their innovative and effective ways to manage risk while working within a partnership. So again, a great build from this morning's panel session. We'll be sending you a roundup email at the end of the day with an evaluation. So please let us know how you felt the day went. We always take your feedback really seriously and act on it. And thank you all again. Thank you for your questions in the chat. Thank you to our panel. We look forward to seeing you all at later sessions today. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you.